Folks have been asking me advice on how, what, and how often they should be feeding their snakes. But like everything in life, there's no single method that works for every snake and every keeper. The best path is to explore various methods to determine what will work best for you and your animal. So today, we'll do just that. Let's slither on into it. So I did a bunch of research for you guys and found this gem that should just help sum everything up in a nutshell. So informative, right? The internet, folks. Anyway, let's look at some more accurate information. Our knowledge about how to care for snakes in captivity has been advancing a lot in recent years. But as many resources as there are to pull from, the conflicting information can get confusing. You shouldn't feel bad if you're not an expert already, and certainly not for asking questions in order to increase your level of care. Internet forums can be a daunting place for new keepers, who are often bullied for their lack of experience. But here on Snake Therapy, I want to support education in a way that makes everyone feel encouraged to do better for their pets. Because if you're afraid of backlash for your lack of knowledge, it'll only cause you to remain stuck, which risks the welfare of the animal. So let's look at the physiology of how snakes eat, the differences between species and their eating habits, and look more closely at the variables that might influence feeding them in captivity, as well as what to do when you run into issues. Snakes have the same organs as we do for swallowing and digesting food: an esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, but that's where the similarities stop. Their jaws aren't locked together bone to bone, but instead connected by stretchy ligaments that allow them to open their mouths insanely wide. The skin between their scales and their organs themselves are extremely elastic in order to accommodate prey that's sometimes larger than they are. While they swallow, the muscles around their esophagus contract to crush the prey and help them to swallow it more easily. Ever wonder how they breathe when their mouth and throat is so full? During feeding, you'll see a snake extend its glottis out below the prey item to allow for respiration. Snakes don't have a diaphragm like we do, and instead use their muscles and the motion of their ribs to push air in and out of their lungs. Scientists have proposed that some constrictors may be able to relocate the positioning of their lungs and their hearts during eating to help them continue breathing. Amazing. They increase the size of their heart muscles and circulatory system in order to pump more blood and to boost their digestive processes. Once the food's down their gullets, their stomach's pH level drops extremely low and produces high levels of acid and digestive enzymes to begin the process of breaking down food, dissolving and absorbing everything except hair and the calcium in the bones, both of which are then excreted in their poop. Fun fact: venomous snakes don't just use their venom to kill or subdue their prey, but also to break it down more efficiently once ingested. While digesting, a snake's stomach muscles will contract, kind of like they're chewing on the inside. Because they don't actually masticate, and because of how much their bodies need to go through in order to eat, it takes them days or even weeks to digest their prey. And it's not just a snake's organs that change while eating, but their metabolism also shifts dramatically over the course of preparing to eat, digesting, and the time before their next meal. And that digestion takes a lot of energy. For large meals, there could be an increase of up to 44 times their metabolic rate, which is costing them almost half the energy they get from eating the meal just to process it. Because of the amount of energy required and the fact that snakes can't produce their own body heat, they need to thermoregulate after eating to facilitate digestion, which means finding some extra warmth. That's why you might see your snake going to the warmer part of its enclosure after eating, and why providing a temperature gradient for them is so important. Without it, digestion can be inhibited, running the risk of the prey either not being digested properly and literally rotting inside its body, or cause the snake to regurgitate its meal. You thought you didn't like to throw up? Well, for a snake, those powerful acids and enzymes in its stomach can cause serious damage to its esophagus if it regurgitates its meal. And eating large prey not only requires a lot of energy, but it also impairs a snake's locomotive abilities, which makes it more vulnerable. And if a snake feels stressed or threatened after eating, it might throw up its food simply in order to regain the energy required to get to safety. This is why you shouldn't handle or disturb a snake after it eats for at least 24 to 48 hours. If your snake ever regurgitates, it's cause for concern and extra care. Check that the enclosure temperatures are appropriate, don't handle or bother them, and don't offer food again for another 2 weeks to allow its system to recover. If it happens often, either there's something wrong with its environment, you need to adjust your interaction with it, or you may need to take it to the vet to verify it isn't sick. After understanding the basic physiology of snake digestion, the most important thing you need to learn in terms of feeding your snake is, well, all about your snake. A ball python and a corn snake are not going to be eating the same meals or necessarily feed on the same schedule as each other because the two species are so different. I mean, we can generalize and say that snakes eat once every week or two, but it's really not that simple. And if you treat it as such, you could end up either under or overfeeding your pet. Take time to do some research, get advice from breeders and various sources. But also, it's important to take advice as guidance, not rule. If you want your individual snake to be healthy and long-lived, you should not only understand its biology, habitat, and preferred prey, but also pay attention to your specific animal's behavior, growth rate, body condition, and its response to what and how you're feeding it. Tracking your feedings is important. There are apps you can use to help you track feeding and health, or you could simply use a note on your phone to record when and what the last feeding was. It doesn't have to be fancy, but keeping records is extremely valuable. With 9 snakes of my own, I could just decide that feeding day is every Monday and make it easy for myself. Many breeders who have lots of animals will do something like that, but my snakes are very different from each other, both by species and age. Personally, my neurodivergent brain necessitates that I be very detailed about this, and none of the apps I've tried have been quite what I wanted. So I've actually developed my own. Let me know in the comments if you'd like to see how it works. For today though, I just want you to take away the importance of being responsible about whatever method you do decide to use. The time it takes for a snake to digest will vary depending on the species, its metabolic rate, and the size of the prey, which means that how often you feed them is not a single answer that suits every snake at every age. Generally speaking, though, it takes at least 3 to 5 days for a snake to fully digest its meal, so you need to space out feedings accordingly. Overfeeding and obesity is a major issue for captive snakes, who expend less energy hunting and are kept in small enclosures without opportunity for exercise. Power feeding, which some people do in order to get their snake to grow bigger faster, is a great way to shorten a snake's lifespan. Please don't do that. It's a beautiful thing to watch them grow naturally over their long lifespans, so just enjoy the process. Doing a Google search for how often I should feed my pet snake will bring up, unsurprisingly, oversimplified results and a lot of opinions. But we can hit on some generalizations as starting points for the most common families of pet snakes: pythons, boas, and colubrids. Pythons and boas are usually ambush predators, sitting in wait for their prey to come to them as opposed to actively seeking it out like most colubrids. That means the former usually have slower metabolisms and need to eat less frequently, and they tend to be larger than colubrids, so they can eat bigger prey items that'll keep them slated until whenever the next opportunity to eat comes along. Colubrids are active hunters, and using more energy to find their prey means more energy expenditure and therefore higher metabolisms. So they might eat slightly smaller meals more often. There's no one schedule to rule them all here. I'll put some links to some charts for a few popular captive species in the description for you to reference. Just remember to look at info from a variety of sources. Find a happy medium from those suggestions and then observe your animal and how it responds. In all reality, without studying snakes extensively in the wild for their entire lives, there's no way to put an exact number on this. And even then, a wild animal's diet and feeding frequency will always be different than a captive one's. What you do need to know as a keeper is how to pay attention to a snake's body condition. If you're not weighing them regularly, which is okay, then just be able to visually identify the signs of obesity or starvation. It's hard for humans to relate to the way that snakes eat, so we have to remind ourselves that they can and often do go without food for months in the wild. So you won't starve your animal if you skip a feeding or two. In fact, one hognose breeder I spoke with said she intentionally skips a feeding once every month in order to make sure they completely empty their systems of waste and get some exercise hunting. This makes a lot of sense to me and seems like a really healthy practice that I might adopt myself. Wild snakes may find prey in plenty sometimes and then have scarcity for a while after, and they're evolved to adapt to those conditions. For a snake, being a little hungry for a week is way less of a health risk than being obese. But let's talk about two of the most significant variables that should be taken into account for feeding your snake. What and what size prey you're giving them. To know what size prey to feed your snake, a common rule of thumb is that the prey should be around 10 to 15% of their body weight. But if you're not someone who weighs their snake or its food, then an easier rule of thumb is that the prey should be at least as large or even just slightly larger than the width of the widest part of their bodies. I'll repeat that because it's really common for people to get it wrong. The prey should be as large or even slightly larger than the width of the largest part of their bodies. I've heard people say they thought they were supposed to be looking at the snake's head size to judge how big the food item should be. But that amazing ability to open their maws so wide is evolution at its finest. So even though it's hard to fathom your tiny baby shoelace eating something bigger than its head, don't underestimate their abilities because you could end up underfeeding them. If your prey item is too small, but the next item seems too big, you have a couple of options. First, you could alter the feeding schedule a bit. Like when I noticed that Nymeria was looking a little underweight and her backbone was a little too pronounced, for a short time, I kept the prey the same and decreased the time in between her feedings by a couple of days. An alternative to changing the schedule would be to feed the snake multiple smaller prey items that equal to the size and weight of a larger one in one feeding. I don't do it often as it's a little bit more taxing on their digestion, but it's not going to hurt them. I mean, if they stumbled on a nest of animals in the wild, they'd most likely gorge themselves as much as they could in one sitting because that rare opportunity would avert the need to hunt again for a while. That would be a rare occurrence though, so I tend to lean towards altering the number of days between meals, just making sure to allow time for full digestion in between. You could also feed them that larger prey, as long as it's really not too big, and then extend the time in between feedings. Elora is a teeny tiny little colubrid, but she seems to digest extremely fast. That lump from her food goes away very quickly and she poops soon after. Even though she's ready to size up to fuzzies, I wanted to finish the bag of pinkies I had first, so in her case, I've fed her 2 at once and increased the number of days in between her meals. It's all about the individual situation and the animal, and it may change from month to month, which is why keeping good records of your feedings is very important. My king snakes eat very differently, not just from my boas, but from each other. Hobbs' species does tend to eat smaller prey in the wild, and recently he just refuses prey that's as wide as his body. He was overweight for a bit, but now his body condition looks fine and I'm not concerned about it. Anu is 4, and up until recently she was on about a 10 to 12 day cycle, and I'll admit she sometimes acted as a garbage disposal in the cases of when my smaller snakes refused a meal, but that had to stop when she started gaining weight. No more midnight snacks for her. She's slimmed down now, and 14 days seems to be the sweet spot for her. She also used to eat anything I offered her, but lately she started showing a clear preference for a certain type of prey. Yes, snakes show flavor preferences. So let's talk about what to feed snakes now. Variety does a body good. Any body. I mean, you don't eat the same thing every meal of your life, right? Well, providing some variety in your snake's diet is a great way to keep them healthy and give them some enrichment. Rats, mice, chicks, those are the easiest to come by, and they'll have different nutritional value. So I try to mix it up as much as I can. As I mentioned, Anu started showing a preference for prey, refusing mice or rats, but devouring chicks. So I stuck with them for a couple months, and then the last time I offered her a rat pup, she ate it enthusiastically. King snakes are not normally picky eaters. They'll pretty much eat anything that they can overpower in the wild, so for snakes like that, it's definitely good to offer them a variety of food items. Although mice, rats, and chicks are the easiest ones to buy, others are available from specialty vendors, and depending on the species, some snakes will eat fish or even chicken breast you can buy at the grocery store. Just make sure you do some homework before you offer them something unique, and being creative never means feeding your snake random wild-caught prey items. If you think the solution to the rodent infestation at your house is feeding them to your snakes, think again. That'd be a great way to introduce a parasite like mites to your snake, or worse, poison from mousetraps. And now we get to the contentious part of this topic, feeding live versus frozen thawed. People who aren't reptile keepers often just assume I feed live prey to my snakes, and have even said that the idea of doing it was the one thing that kept them from getting a snake as a pet themselves. But I don't. Please don't feed live prey to your pet snake. This channel is focused on the welfare of captive snakes, and although there are plenty of people who do feed live, I cannot and will not recommend it because it's a risk to the animal. But isn't it more natural, you ask? Don't you want them to be able to hunt like they would in the wild? Well, they're not in the wild. They're in a box. No matter how big your enclosure is, it's a box. As ambush predators in the wild, snakes have the element of surprise in their favor. But in a box, that rat is going to know something bad is coming and may very well fight back. Not only is it inhumane to cause the prey animal to suffer the stress of knowingly being hunted by the snake, but even a small mouse bite can severely injure a pet snake during a feeding, which could lead to a potentially life-threatening infection. Go ahead and Google image that if you don't believe me, and you have a strong stomach. Seeing pictures of snakes with huge chunks of their bodies eaten away by rats might convince you if I haven't done a good enough job. It's just not worth it. And there's no valid reason to do it if it risks the safety of your animal. Not to mention, it's easier and more convenient for you to feed frozen thawed prey to your snake. If your snake decides not to eat the live prey, well, now you have new pets to care for. I personally buy frozen prey in bulk, so I don't have to go to a pet store every week. It's cheaper and allows me to keep a variety of options for all of my snakes at any given time. If you're already on the frozen thawed train, are you doing it correctly? There could be a host of reasons why a snake refuses food, and although I will admit to over-worrying about refusals myself at times, specifically when it was a new or a baby snake, usually it's not cause for panic about the snake's health. They've evolved to go months, even a year without food, and there are very normal reasons that a snake just doesn't feel the need to eat. Being in shed is one, which is why I usually don't even bother offering them food during that time. Sometimes they're just not hungry, and that's okay. Just try again in another week or so. Mature snakes will often go off food during the winter for quite some time in preparation for the breeding season. Like Helios fasts for anywhere from 3 to 5 months every winter. And now that Hobbs has reached maturity, he just went off food for a month and a half, during which time he acted like a maniac, looking all over his enclosure for a lady friend. And I swear he even tried to get it on with himself once or twice. Again, he's special. If refusal happens repeatedly though, you need to look at your husbandry. If your temperatures are off, the humidity is wrong, or your setup is inadequate to their needs, it will cause stress. And if a snake is stressed, it will refuse food. Make sure your snake feels safe in its home. If it's a baby, it could be overwhelmed by a large enclosure that doesn't have enough cover. 2 hides are not always enough. Some snakes won't feel secure without a significant amount of visual barriers and clutter in their enclosure. Although you may like a minimalist aesthetic in your home, or you want less in the enclosure because you want to be able to see your snake, that's usually not what's best for them. For most snakes, clutter is king. Galadriel was a very picky eater when I first brought her home. And because she was only a month and a half old, it definitely caused me some concern. I worried she wouldn't develop properly. The breeder had been feeding her live, so not only did she get plunked into a new environment, she was also being given a totally different food item when I offered her frozen thawed. She refused time and again, and in this case, I did actually resort to feeding her live prey for a bit, but only because fuzzy mice don't have teeth or claws, so I knew there'd be no risk to her safety, and I figured it'd be better to just take one step at a time to get her settled in. After a month or so, though, I was ready to lay down the law on frozen thawed, but it wasn't working. Sometimes she'd even refuse the live mice. Normally, I don't advise feeding your snake outside of its enclosure. The process of taking them in and out can actually cause more stress, but it also can sometimes work to get them to start eating. So I put her favorite hide in a secure bin and left her and the mouse in there overnight, and sometimes it worked. But that was annoying, and I didn't want her to get used to it. In the end, I decided to completely redo her enclosure. I added 2 extra hides and a ton of clutter with plants and branches. Guess what? She ate the next thawed prey item I offered, and she's eaten like a champ ever since. She was a shy baby, but after I did this, I actually saw her more often roaming around and basking because she felt safe enough to do so. So, if you're transitioning a snake from something they know to something they don't, there may be a period of adjustment that isn't always fun, but they'll get there if you provide them with what they need. And this will vary from snake to snake, not just species to species. Nymeria is the same species and even from the same father as Galadriel, and this girl has always eaten what I offered her, always been social and curious, and prefers more space and height in her enclosure than her sister does. One absolute rule to follow if your snake isn't eating is avoid handling them until they do. Just let them be until they're on track. I know it's hard when you just want to hang out with your pet, but their health is more important. If you're sure your husbandry is correct, but your snake seems like it's just being a picky eater, or if you're trying to transition them from live to frozen thawed, you might want to try varying what you're offering them. If they refuse mice, try rats, or if they refuse white mice, try mice with dark fur. Eventually, they'll get hungry enough that they'll take what you give them. Don't be afraid to go months without offering them food if they're not a very young baby. Just pay attention to their body condition and wait it out. They'll slim down if they go off food for 6 months, but if they don't look badly underweight, they'll probably be just fine. If your snake still refuses food and you've tried absolutely everything else I've mentioned, and you don't see signs of illness or mites yourself, and it's been 6 months to a year, that's when you might be needing to take them to the vet. People do force snakes to eat, but assist feeding really shouldn't be necessary except in very extreme cases. And taking such drastic and traumatic action should certainly not be done if it's been less than 6 months for older snakes. Most likely, the snake isn't eating because there's something off with its environment, or it's adjusting to the season or a new home, rather than that it's sick. So take a look at yourself and your practices and do some research on your animal before you freak out and get frustrated with them. It's okay if you don't know everything about how to care for snakes at the moment. The most important thing is to never stop learning and trying to do better. I learn something new every time I make an episode, which reminds me, I do put a lot of time and effort into doing research and making these videos, so if you appreciate that, consider becoming a member on Patreon to support the channel, and please hit those subscribe and like buttons before you go. And if there's something you'd like to learn more about, then let's do it together. Comment below or join the Discord server and make suggestions in the episode ideas channel. I am always down to increase my knowledge base about snakes. Until then, happy feeding to you all, and Nymeria and I will see you next time for more snake therapy. You good girl.